Our gospel reading this morning comes from the 13th chapter of Matthew's gospel. It is part of a larger section of teachings on the kingdom. And in fact, the reading skips over some other parables and teachings on the kingdom as we go from the first parable to the explanation of the parable that Jesus gives the disciples later. Listen for what the Spirit would speak to the church through these words. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slave said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, 'Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" Then we skip over some other parables and are now inside with the disciples. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will be thrown into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Back in March, when the stay-at-home order was first announced, I don't think any of us could have imagined that we would be holding worship today in an empty sanctuary, live streaming it into people's homes. Even now, in mid-July, we still don't know when we might again have anything like worship as it used to be. COVID-19 has turned the church world upside down. No one knows exactly what church is going to look like in the coming years. Live streaming is here to stay, no doubt, even once we do return to some form of in-person worship. But it seems likely that many congregations will never recover from this. Unlike FCPC, many churches have nothing in the way of financial reserves, and they operate on extremely tight budgets. Some who study religious institutions predict numerous church closings in the coming years. But what about church in general? What's going to happen? Will live streaming worship into homes open church up to a whole new group of people? Or will it accelerate the established trend of church decline? Will people start to treat church like Netflix, grabbing a little worship when they have some time or the mood strikes them? Will this further move church from the center of people's lives and from the center of culture, further diminishing the prominent place church once occupied? Over 20 years ago, long before COVID-19, Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann suggested the metaphor of exile as a way to describe where the church finds itself in America. He said that we had been deported from our comfortable homeland of the mid-20th century into a world whose ways we do not fully understand. The stores remain open and the youth sports teams play their games during our sacred worship times. And neither the public schools nor the culture at large does anything to encourage church participation as they once did. The American landscape has changed dramatically since the 1950s. And institutions like the Presbyterian Church, who had their heyday in that time, find themselves aliens in a strange land. If the metaphor of exile was appropriate to the close of the 20th century, surely it is even more appropriate today. The forces that led Dr. Brueggemann to speak of the church in exile are still with us, perhaps even stronger. And now COVID-19 could push church further to the edges of people's lives, to the edges of daily life. In the Bible, when Israel is taken into literal exile in Babylon, they faced a crisis. In a strange land, there was nothing to support their way of life, their religious practices. The temple was gone. The Ark of the Covenant lost. There was no altar where offerings could be made. In the Babylonian culture that surrounded them, there were different ways, different gods, different religious practices. And it would be easy, even tempting, to simply adopt the ways of the prevailing culture. Exiles are always in danger of disappearing, of being absorbed into the surrounding culture. Countless civilizations and cultures have disappeared over the centuries as a result. In order to survive, exiles must create a distinctiveness, a peculiarity. They must come up with distinct ways and practices that set them apart from the culture around them, that give them a distinct identity. For Israel in exile, Sabbath keeping and synagogue became crucial ways for them to maintain that distinct identity in the midst of a culture that was hostile to them. But what about us? The parable of the weeds and the wheat that we heard moments ago was not addressed to literal exiles, but they may well have been metaphorical exiles like us. The people of Jesus' day lived under Roman rule in a Greco-Roman world. Their original language had disappeared from daily use, used only in religious gatherings. Matthew's gospel is addressed to Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus who still go to synagogue and still see themselves as Jews. And for them, the sense of exile must have been even greater. Rome had destroyed Jerusalem and its grand temple in the time between Jesus and the writing of Matthew's gospel. On top of that, synagogue leaders were starting to wonder whether these followers of Jesus were really Jews. And some synagogues were asking people to renounce Jesus if they wanted to remain as members. Matthew's gospel addresses Christians facing multiple pressures to disappear, to be absorbed into the surrounding culture of the Greco-Roman world or the synagogue. And to these people, Matthew tells this parable, one that shows up only in his gospel. And I wonder if it wasn't meant for exiles. Wasn't meant to encourage them to hold fast to their faith, to maintain their distinct identity. Unfortunately, our Bible translation may perhaps obscure that a bit. Now, if you're a gardener, you know about the problem of weeds. If you don't stay after them, they will take over a flower bed or a garden. You have to pull them, dig them out, spray them with weed killer. Personally, I hate pulling weeds in my vegetable garden. But I don't worry at all about uprooting the vegetables when I have to do so. The concern that is raised in this parable. Turns out that the weeds in the parable are not run-of-the-mill weeds, and that's the translation problem. Jesus actually says an enemy came and sowed zizanium among the wheat. Zizanium is a specific weed, a kind of darnel. It looks almost exactly like wheat, even more so when it's young. And some varieties of it produce a mildly poisonous grain. And so this enemy has done something much, much more sinister than throwing out some crabgrass seed into the weeds. As Jesus' explanation of the parable makes clear, there are forces at work in the world seeking to undermine the way of Jesus, the way of God's new day. And very often those forces are well disguised. The only way to tell them apart in the end is by the fruit that they bear. Jesus regularly insists that his followers are supposed to stand out, to be different. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. We are supposed to show the world the ways of Jesus, not blend in to the ways of the world. That's always been true, but it is even more so for exiles. If we are to be something that matters, if we are to be something that those who are not acculturated to church might want to learn more about, we must show the world a different way, a better way. And Jesus insists, as crazy as his way sometimes sounds, that it is a better way. But living in the distinctive, different ways of the kingdom is more than a survival strategy for exiles. It is Jesus' call to new, purposeful, true, amazing life. Life as we were created to live it. A life so transformed and so renewed that it is called salvation. Salvation. Something so much more than what happens when you die. Salvation. True wholeness. True aliveness. You are the good seed sown in God's good garden and called to bear good fruit. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Those called to show the world, to change the world, to show the world the way. And when together we live into that call, we will experience new life, new purpose, resurrection life, here and now. Thanks be to God.